dimly lit courtroom buzzed with whispers as storm clouds gathered outside. Rain streaked down the tall windows, painting the room in streaks of grey. Inside, the air was heavy with tension as a young woman stood trembling, her shackled hands clutching each other tightly. Every pair of eyes burned with silent judgment, save for her own, which brimmed with fear and an unshakable sense of betrayal. Miriam Andrews, a 28-year-old single mother, had never imagined her life would spiral into this nightmare. Known for her quiet demeanor and compassionate heart, she worked tirelessly as a nurse to provide for her son, Caleb. But fate had other plans. Accused of a crime she didn't commit, Miriam now faced the ultimate punishment. Her eyes reflected a soul fighting to hold on to hope, even as the world condemned her. Beneath the fear, her spirit whispered one truth: she was innocent. As the judge's gavel slammed down, pronouncing her sentence, a cold wave of finality washed over Miriam. "Death by electric chair," he declared. The courtroom erupted in a cacophony of murmurs and gasps. Miriam's defense attorney bowed his head, defeated. She glanced at the gallery, searching for a familiar face, but even her family's seats were empty. "I didn't do it," she whispered, her voice cracking. With tears streaming, she made a silent vow. Her story wouldn't end here. Somewhere, the truth awaited, and so did her miracle. The sun never quite shone in the small industrial town of Graysville. A thick veil of smog and despair hung over the brick buildings, where chimneys puffed black smoke into the grey sky. This was Miriam's home, a place where dreams withered before they could bloom. She lived in a cramped two-bedroom apartment, its walls marked by years of struggle. Despite her challenges, Miriam poured every ounce of energy into her work as a nurse at the local hospital, where patients often regarded her as their only beacon of kindness in an otherwise harsh world. Her son, Caleb, was her anchor, the reason she pushed forward, even when exhaustion weighed her down. But even in this familiar life of struggle, a shadow loomed. A co-worker, jealous and vengeful, had planted the seeds of her downfall. Caleb Andrews. Caleb, Miriam's 7-year-old son, was the light of her life. With his wide brown eyes and an infectious laugh, he could melt even the hardest hearts. Despite his young age, Caleb carried a quiet wisdom. He sensed his mother's struggles and often tried to cheer her up with his drawings or by reenacting scenes from his favorite superhero cartoons. Caleb was Miriam's reminder of what she was fighting for, her reason to endure. Daniel Harper. Daniel, Miriam's public defender, was an overworked and underpaid lawyer with a reputation for taking on impossible cases. While his heart was in the right place, his resources were stretched thin, leaving him unable to mount the kind of defense Miriam needed. His frustration grew as the trial progressed, knowing he was losing not because of her guilt, but because of the broken system. Margaret Hall. Margaret was Miriam's jealous co-worker who played a sinister role in framing her. She was cunning and manipulative, hiding her malevolence behind a facade of charm. Her motives? Envy, pure and simple. Miriam's compassion and popularity among patients had made Margaret feel overshadowed, leading her to orchestrate a betrayal that would change Miriam's life forever. The day began like any other, with Miriam rushing to the hospital, her uniform neatly pressed, and her son's lunch packed in a brown paper bag. But by noon her world had begun to unravel. Police officers stormed into the hospital, their stern faces and authoritative voices silencing the bustling corridors. "Miriam Andrews, you're under arrest for the murder of Dr. Gerald Hunt," one officer declared, slapping cold handcuffs on her wrists. Her breath hitched as gasps echoed around her. The words didn't register at first. Dr. Hunt was her mentor, a man she respected deeply. The evidence was damning. a bottle of poison found in her locker, and an eyewitness claiming to have seen her arguing with the victim hours before his death. Miriam protested her innocence, her voice trembling with desperation, but the officers dragged her away. As she passed her stunned co-workers, her eyes landed on Margaret, who smirked ever so subtly. It was in that moment that Miriam realized this wasn't just a misunderstanding. Someone had set her up, and she would have to fight to prove her innocence. As Miriam's trial date approached, the tension in the courtroom grew thicker with each passing day. The town's media coverage painted her as a guilty party before a verdict was even reached. News anchors stood outside the courthouse, microphones thrust toward anyone who would speak, creating a public spectacle that only intensified the pressure on Miriam. Inside the courtroom, the trial became an emotional battleground. Miriam's defense lawyer, Daniel Harper, struggled to make headway. Every objection he raised was met with skepticism, and every defense strategy felt like it was being torn apart by the opposing counsel. Margaret, the star witness for the prosecution, was more than eager to present her story, one that painted Miriam as an envious, unstable woman, willing to take drastic measures to get ahead. Meanwhile, Miriam felt increasingly isolated. Her son, Caleb, was becoming more withdrawn, and the strain of the situation was evident in his usually joyful demeanor. Miriam's once strong bond with him started to fray under the pressure, leaving her feeling more alone than ever. Inside the courtroom, the tension reached its peak during the cross-examination of Margaret, where Daniel managed to chip away at the inconsistencies in her statements. But it was too late. The damage was already done. The judge had heard enough, and it seemed that a guilty verdict was inevitable. Miriam's fear turned into a cold realization. She was running out of time. The final day of the trial arrived, and the atmosphere in the courtroom was thick with anticipation. Miriam sat at the defense table, her hands clenched into fists. The weight of the world pressed down on her shoulders as she tried to maintain control, though every fiber of her being screamed in panic. She caught glimpses of Caleb's face in the courtroom, his tear-streaked cheeks and wide eyes that had lost their spark. The pain of seeing him like this almost overwhelmed her, but she couldn't let it break her. Not yet. When the jury filed back into the room, Miriam's heart pounded in her chest. Her breath caught as the foreman stood, delivering the devastating verdict. Guilty on all charges. Miriam's knees buckled, and for a moment the room spun around her. A cold shiver ran through her body as the sentence was handed down. Death by electric chair. Her mind could barely grasp the finality of it. "Your Honor, we ask for mercy," Daniel pleaded, but it was already too late. The judge's cold stare locked onto Miriam's eyes, and she felt as if her entire world had come crashing down in a single moment. As she was escorted from the courtroom, the harsh reality of the situation settled in. Miriam had just been condemned to death for a crime she didn't commit. But even as despair took hold of her, there was a small flicker of defiance deep inside. She wasn't done yet. Not by a long shot. Miriam's days in prison were a blur of cold steel bars, routine searches, and the ever-present sting of injustice. The cell was small, and the walls seemed to close in around her, each tick of the clock echoing louder in her mind. With each passing hour, her world seemed more hopeless. The other inmates whispered, some with sympathy, others with skepticism. No one truly knew what had happened to her, but in prison, reputation was everything, and Miriam's name was now tainted with a crime she couldn't shake. Her appeal was denied, and though Daniel worked tirelessly behind the scenes, the prospects of a successful appeal were slim. Miriam was running out of options. The electric chair loomed over her like a shadow she couldn't escape. Her mind, usually sharp, was clouded by fear. She spent her nights awake, thinking about Caleb. What would happen to him when she was gone? He didn't deserve this. She was allowed occasional visits, and one day, as she sat across from Daniel in the visitor's room, a new, unexpected development occurred. He leaned in close, his voice low and urgent. "I've been talking to a private investigator. We may have found something, a lead that could change everything." Miriam's heart skipped a beat. "What is it?" "The evidence points to Margaret. We think she planted the poison in your locker. There's a chance we can prove it, but we need time, and more resources than we have right now." Time. Time was something Miriam didn't have much of. The electric chair was still scheduled for her, and every minute counted. Miriam's time in prison had changed her. The woman who had entered those cold, concrete walls, overwhelmed by fear and uncertainty, was no longer the same person. In the beginning, she'd been desperate, clinging to the hope that the truth would come to light, that justice would prevail. But after weeks of isolation and harsh realities, something inside her shifted. She became more focused, more determined. The spark that had once driven her to succeed in her career, to be a loving mother, had now turned into a fire for survival. Every day she spent in that cell, she found new ways to hold on to hope. She began reading more, sharpening her mind, looking for anything that could help her case. She became less afraid of the walls around her, realizing that they couldn't hold her spirit. Miriam spent hours reflecting on her life before prison, her dedication to helping others as a nurse, her love for Caleb, and the dreams they once shared. Those memories fueled her determination. They were the only things that kept her grounded. As the days wore on, she started to grow closer to a few of the other inmates, women who had been wronged by the system just as she had. Some had lost everything to lies, others to betrayal. They shared their stories with Miriam, and in return, she shared hers. Through their bond, she began to understand the importance of community and trust in a place where hope seemed like a foreign concept. Miriam was no longer just a mother fighting for her son. She was a woman fighting for herself, for the chance to prove her innocence and reclaim her life. As Miriam's fight for justice continued, she began to rely on a few key individuals who played crucial roles in both her emotional and legal battles. Each character brought their own strength to the table, helping Miriam navigate the increasingly complex situation she found herself in. Daniel Harper, the lawyer with his own demons. Daniel, Miriam's defense attorney, was not just a legal lifeline. He had become a confidant. Initially driven by his professional duty to clear her name, he soon developed a personal stake in her case. A man with his own troubled past, Daniel had seen the justice system fail too many times. His dedication to Miriam's cause was born not just out of a desire to win, but out of a shared understanding of what it meant to fight for the truth. Though his efforts were often met with roadblocks, his resilience never faltered. His personal connection with Miriam deepened as he worked late into the nights, uncovering new details that could sway the trial in her favor. He wasn't just working to save her, he was fighting to redeem his own faith in justice. Lena, the prisoner who knows too much. Among the inmates, Lena stood out. A woman with a hardened exterior, she had been incarcerated for nearly a decade, serving time for a crime she'd never committed. Lena's story was eerily similar to Miriam's, wrongfully convicted, trapped by a system that didn't care. She saw something in Miriam that others didn't. At first, Miriam was reluctant to engage with her, but Lena's persistence wore her down. Over time, they formed a quiet alliance, with Lena offering advice on survival in prison and sharing her knowledge of the legal system. She had contacts on the outside, people who could help Miriam. Lena also had a network of fellow inmates who, despite their own pasts, recognized Miriam's innocence and were willing to risk everything to help her. Caleb, the son, who holds her heart. Back on the outside, Caleb was the anchor that kept Miriam going. His visits were bittersweet. Each time he walked into the prison, his eyes were filled with confusion and sadness. Miriam had raised him to be strong, but seeing him so vulnerable shattered her. Their once inseparable bond was being tested in ways she had never imagined. Caleb was starting to pull away emotionally, overwhelmed by the stigma of having a mother on death row. He was struggling at school and with his friends. Yet, there were moments of clarity during their visits, when his face softened and he would tell her how much he loved her, how much he believed she was innocent. These moments, though fleeting, gave Miriam the strength to keep pushing forward. Margaret, the woman behind the lies. Though a secondary character in terms of screen time, Margaret's presence loomed over everything Miriam did. Margaret had been the catalyst for Miriam's fall from grace. A former colleague who had once been friendly with Miriam, she now served as the prosecution's star witness. The animosity between them, however, wasn't as clear-cut as it appeared. Miriam had never wronged Margaret personally, but she began to realize that Margaret's jealousy over Miriam's success in their shared professional field might have been the root cause of her betrayal. As Miriam pieced together the puzzle of the events leading to her conviction, she began to suspect that Margaret's motives were more than just professional rivalry. They were personal, and they were driven by a darker, more sinister need to destroy Miriam for reasons Miriam could barely understand. But Margaret's lies were starting to unravel, and Miriam was determined to use every shred of evidence to expose the truth. The turning point came unexpectedly. After months of legal battles and emotional turmoil, Miriam received a visit that would change everything. It wasn't from her lawyer, Daniel, or her son, Caleb. It was from a journalist named Sarah Miles, known for her investigative work on wrongful convictions. She had been following Miriam's case closely, and what she revealed during that visit shocked Miriam to her core. "I've been digging into your case," Sarah said, her voice steady but filled with urgency, "and I think I've found something that could turn the entire trial on its head." Miriam leaned forward, her heart racing. "What do you mean? Is it new evidence?" Sarah nodded. "Yes, but it's not just evidence. It's something bigger. We've been able to track down someone who might be able to clear your name, a man named Victor Dalton. He was the lead investigator on your case before the trial, and he's been hiding something." Miriam's breath caught in her throat. Hiding something? What could he possibly be hiding? Sarah hesitated before continuing, her eyes scanning the room as if ensuring no one was listening. "Victor was the one who uncovered the tampered evidence in your case, but when it came time for the trial, he was forced to suppress it. He's been working with the prosecution this whole time, burying the truth. If we can get him to speak out, we can prove your innocence." Miriam's mind spun. Victor Dalton, the man who had once seemed like a reliable source of truth, had been playing both sides. And now there was a chance, just a slim chance, that he could help her clear her name. "I don't understand," Miriam whispered, her voice shaking. "Why would he do this? Why would he let me suffer?" Sarah sighed, her face filled with sympathy. "The pressure, the corruption within the system. He was threatened, Miriam, but there's something else. I think he feels guilty now. He's been living with this lie for years, but he won't come forward unless he feels safe." The implications of Sarah's words were staggering. Victor Dalton, a man who had once been the key to her case, could now be the one to set her free. But convincing him to break his silence would not be easy. Miriam knew it would take more than just a good argument. It would take trust, and it would take a plan. Miriam's mind was now a whirlwind of possibilities. The electric chair was still looming, but this new revelation gave her a glimmer of hope. If she could get to Victor, convince him to tell the truth, she could be saved. The question now was, how far was she willing to go to expose the truth? And what would happen if she failed? The days following Sarah's revelation were filled with a growing sense of urgency and fear. Miriam knew she had limited time. Every moment brought her closer to the inevitable. With the electric chair still looming over her, she couldn't afford to waste any more precious time. But the challenge now lay in reaching Victor Dalton, the man who held the key to her freedom. He was a ghost. No one knew his whereabouts, and his name was rarely mentioned in the court documents. Getting to him was going to take all of Miriam's remaining strength and cunning. Daniel, her lawyer, was skeptical when Miriam first brought up Victor's involvement. He had his doubts, and he made it clear that he wasn't willing to risk his career on an unverified lead. "We need solid evidence, Miriam," he said, his voice strained. "We can't afford to chase ghosts. This could end up hurting your case." But Miriam couldn't ignore the sliver of hope that Sarah had given her. She refused to let fear and doubt paralyze her, not when she was so close to the truth. She pressed Daniel, determined to make him see the urgency of the situation. "We have to try. I don't care if it's a risk. I'm running out of time." Despite his reservations, Daniel agreed to help her track down Victor. They enlisted the help of a private investigator, someone who specialized in digging into the shadows of the criminal justice system. For the next few days, they worked relentlessly, following every lead, every clue that might bring them closer to Victor. Meanwhile, Miriam spent every waking moment preparing for what she knew could be her final stand. Her conversations with the other inmates grew more intense as she shared the news of the new lead. Lena, who had become one of her closest allies, offered her support, even though she knew the road ahead would be perilous. "If you can get Victor to testify, you'll have a chance. But remember, you're not just fighting the system, you're fighting the people who don't want the truth to come out." Each passing day brought more tension. Miriam found herself constantly on edge, the weight of the unknown pressing down on her. The prison walls that once felt like her prison were now a cage she could not escape from. The outside world felt distant, unreachable. She spent hours each day pacing in her cell, trying to formulate a plan to figure out how she would confront Victor and convince him to reveal the truth. As the days wore on, Miriam's anxiety began to spiral. Caleb's visits became a bittersweet reminder of everything she had to lose. He was growing more distant, unable to understand the full scope of her situation. Miriam's guilt over not being able to protect him from the reality of her fate was a constant source of pain. But even as their relationship strained, Caleb's unwavering belief in her innocence kept her grounded. One evening, just as Miriam was starting to lose hope, she received unexpected news. The private investigator had tracked down Victor Dalton. He was living in a small, isolated town, keeping a low profile after years of hiding. It was a breakthrough, one that could finally give her the chance to prove her innocence. But Miriam knew the risks. Victor was scared, and if she was going to reach him, she would have to take matters into her own hands. She set her sights on the coming days, knowing that each moment would bring her closer to either salvation or an irreversible tragedy. Miriam's moment of reckoning arrived on a cold, quiet morning. The private investigator had finally tracked down Victor Dalton to a remote farmhouse on the outskirts of town. The weight of the moment pressed down on her as she stood outside, staring at the weather-beaten door of the farmhouse. Everything she had fought for, all the pain and suffering she had endured, came down to this one encounter. She had no idea what she would find once inside, or if Victor would even agree to help her. But there was no turning back now. Caleb's face flashed in her mind, the image of his innocent eyes reminding her of what she was fighting for. Her son, the life they were supposed to have together. Miriam clenched her fists, steadying herself for the task at hand. She had spent months feeling trapped, suffocated by the walls of her prison, but this was her chance, her one shot at freedom, and she wasn't about to let it slip away. She knocked on the door, the sound echoing in the silent morning. Moments later it creaked open, revealing a man who looked nothing like the confident investigator she had imagined. Victor Dalton was older now, his face lined with age and regret, his eyes shadowed by the burden of secrets he had kept for far too long. "What do you want?" His voice was hoarse, distrust seeping through every syllable. Miriam took a deep breath. "I'm Miriam Davis. I was wrongfully convicted of murder, and I need your help to prove my innocence." Victor's face hardened, but he didn't immediately slam the door in her face. Instead, he stepped back slightly, motioning for her to enter. Miriam's heart raced as she crossed the threshold. She couldn't help but notice the disarray inside the house, a reflection of the chaos that had consumed Victor's life after the trial. "You shouldn't have come here," he muttered, locking the door behind her. "If anyone finds out I've been talking to you—" "I'm not here to threaten you," Miriam interrupted, her voice steady but laced with desperation. "I just want the truth. You know what happened. You know the evidence was tampered with, and I know you were the one who found it." Victor flinched at the mention of the tampered evidence, and for a fleeting moment his mask of indifference slipped. Miriam saw a glimpse of the man he used to be, a man who cared about justice and truth, but that man was buried deep beneath years of fear and silence. "You don't understand," Victor said, his voice cracking. "I didn't have a choice. I was told to suppress the evidence. If I hadn't—" "Then they would have killed you too?" Miriam finished for him. She wasn't asking, she knew. The system had a way of swallowing those who dared to expose its flaws. Victor's eyes filled with regret, and Miriam's heart broke for the man who had been just as much a victim of the system as she had. He had been forced into silence by fear, but now there was a chance for redemption. Miriam took a step closer to him, her voice firm but compassionate. "You don't have to live like this anymore, Victor. Help me. Help me bring the truth to light. You can't undo what's been done, but you can stop the injustice from going any further." For a long moment, the two of them stood in silence, the weight of their shared history between them. Miriam's pulse raced as she waited for his response. The decision he made now would decide not only her future, but his as well. Finally, Victor looked up, his face weary but determined. "I can't undo it, but maybe, just maybe, I can make it right." In that moment, Miriam knew that her fight wasn't over, but she had just taken the most crucial step toward freedom. She had found the truth, and with Victor's help, she had the power to expose the lies that had held her captive for so long. The courtroom was a battleground. Miriam's fate hung in the balance as she stood at the center of it all, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. The electric chair was no longer just a looming threat. It was the specter that had haunted her every waking moment. But today, everything was about to change. The truth would be unveiled, and the people who had unjustly condemned her would finally have to face the consequences of their actions. Victor Dalton had agreed to testify, but the process of getting him to the stand had been anything but easy. His testimony was the linchpin, the only thing standing between Miriam and the irreversible sentence that awaited her. For weeks they had prepared him, ensuring that he was ready to face the courtroom, ready to risk everything to tell the truth. The air inside the courtroom was thick with tension. Miriam's heart pounded in her chest as she watched Victor walk toward the stand. He was a different man now, no longer the scared, broken figure she had met in his farmhouse. His face was determined, his posture firm, but Miriam could see the fear in his eyes, the remnants of a lifetime spent hiding in the shadows. He was afraid of what would happen to him after this, afraid of the consequences of speaking out. But Victor didn't back down. He took the oath, his voice steady as he promised to tell the truth. The prosecutor, a man Miriam had come to hate with every fiber of her being, stood at his table, eyeing Victor like a predator. He knew that Victor's testimony could shatter everything he had worked for, everything he had built to ensure Miriam's conviction. Victor's voice broke the silence. I was part of the investigation into Miriam Davis's case, but the evidence I found was tampered with. It was manipulated to fit a narrative that wasn't true. I was told to cover it up, to protect the people who needed it to stay hidden. Miriam's breath caught in her throat. It was happening. The truth was finally being spoken, and nothing could stop it now. The prosecutor's face turned pale as he realized what was happening. He stood up, ready to strike back, but Miriam could see the cracks in his armor. The lies he had built were crumbling, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. "This man is lying!" the prosecutor shouted, his voice laced with desperation. "This is all a fabrication, a last-ditch attempt to avoid punishment. We have the evidence that points to her guilt, the witness testimony, the forensic reports." But Victor didn't flinch. "Those reports were altered. The witness was coached. This isn't the truth, and I'm here to make sure you all know it." The room fell into a stunned silence as the weight of Victor's words settled over everyone. Miriam could barely breathe, the hope that had been building in her chest finally rising to the surface. This was the moment she had fought for, the moment that would decide her fate. The prosecutor attempted to counter Victor's testimony, but every argument was met with cold, hard truth. The defense team had prepared for this, and Miriam's lawyer, Daniel, was quick to press the advantage. "You're telling me that all the evidence we've been shown is a lie, that everything we've been led to believe about Miriam Davis is false?" Victor nodded, his voice unwavering. "Yes, everything." Miriam's heart soared as she watched the prosecutor struggle to maintain control. The case was unraveling piece by piece, and there was nothing he could do to put it back together. The truth had come to light, and the pieces of the puzzle were finally falling into place. The judge, who had remained silent throughout the exchange, looked at Victor with a mix of disbelief and authority. "You're saying that the case against Ms. Davis was built on false evidence, Mr. Dalton?" "Yes," Victor replied, his voice strong and clear. "And I'm here to tell you that she didn't commit the crime. The evidence is fabricated. The truth is, she's innocent." In that moment, Miriam knew it was over. The lies had been exposed, and the truth was undeniable. The electric chair, once so certain, was now just a dark memory in the distance. She had been given a second chance, a life she had thought was lost forever. As the judge called for a recess, Miriam couldn't hold back the tears. They were tears of relief, of gratitude, and of the realization that she was finally free. She had fought for this moment, this victory, and now it was hers. The nightmare was over. The prosecutor's face was a picture of defeat as he sat down, knowing he had been bested. The courtroom was filled with a mix of disbelief and awe as people processed the bombshell revelation that had just rocked the entire case. Miriam's lawyer turned to her with a smile, a rare moment of victory in a case that had been anything but ordinary. And as she stood there, her eyes met Caleb's across the room. His face was filled with relief, but there was something more, something she hadn't seen before. It was the look of a mother who had fought for her child's future, and in that moment, Miriam knew that she had won not just for herself, but for the family she had almost lost. As the courtroom drama came to an end, the tension that had gripped Miriam for so long began to dissolve. But not all was resolved. While the immediate threat of her wrongful conviction was lifted, The consequences of the web of lies and deceit she had been trapped in were far-reaching. Caleb, her ex-husband, had been a pillar of support throughout this journey. Despite their complicated history, he had been there when it mattered most, even when the case seemed lost. But Miriam knew that their relationship, strained by years of distance and misunderstandings, could never simply go back to how it was. The truth of his role in her initial conviction, the influence he had under pressure to testify against her, could not be forgotten easily. However, Caleb's willingness to stand by her now, despite the years of turmoil, showed Miriam that some bonds could still be mended. He sought her out after the trial, eyes filled with remorse. "Miriam, I was wrong. I should have fought for you. I let them push me into something I wasn't sure of, and I couldn't undo it until now." She looked at him, his apology hanging in the air between them. It wasn't an easy forgiveness. It was a cautious step toward understanding. "I don't know where we go from here," Miriam said softly, "but thank you for being here when it counted." For now, that was enough. They didn't need to rebuild everything at once, but perhaps, over time, they could find a way to heal the wounds of the past. Meanwhile, Miriam's lawyer, Daniel, who had worked tirelessly on her defense, was ready to move on to other cases. However, the bond they had formed was undeniable. He had been more than just a legal professional. He had been her advocate when the system had failed her. After the trial, Miriam offered him a sincere handshake, her voice thick with emotion. "Thank you, Daniel. You saved my life." Daniel smiled, though it was tinged with sadness. "It was the least I could do. But it wasn't just me. It was you who never gave up, even when everything seemed impossible." In the weeks that followed, Miriam focused on rebuilding her life. The world that had been so chaotic, so uncertain, was beginning to settle. Her legal battle had cost her years, but now she had her freedom, her integrity restored. But it was her relationship with her family that needed the most work. Her mother, once critical and distant, had seen Miriam's strength throughout the ordeal. Though their relationship had been strained, her mother came to Miriam, embracing her with a warmth that had been absent for years. "I never thought I would see the day when you would stand up for yourself like this," her mother admitted, tears in her eyes. "I am so proud of you." Miriam embraced her, feeling the love that had been absent for too long. "Thank you, Mum. I needed to hear that." But the most profound change was in Miriam herself. The journey from despair to salvation had transformed her. She no longer viewed herself as the victim of a broken system. She had become a survivor. The finality of the electric chair, once an inevitable fate, had now become a distant nightmare, replaced by the reality of her newfound freedom and strength. As she looked toward the future, Miriam knew there was no going back to the life she once had. There was no returning to the woman who had been broken by injustice. Instead, she was walking forward into a future filled with hope, resilience, and the courage to rebuild what had been shattered. Her journey wasn't over. It had just begun. In the months that followed her miraculous escape from the electric chair, Miriam grappled with a newfound sense of agency over her life. Her journey was far from over. In fact, it felt like a new chapter had just begun. But what would this next phase look like? Would she embrace the remnants of her old life, or would she forge an entirely new path? The decision was not an easy one. Her past had been filled with pain, betrayal, and mistrust. But it was also laced with the moments of love and clarity she needed to push forward. Miriam stood at the crossroads of her own future, surrounded by the echoes of her past. The fear of being wrongfully accused again, of being overlooked by the same system that had condemned her, loomed like a shadow. But Miriam wasn't a woman to be defined by fear. One quiet evening, while sitting at her kitchen table, the weight of her thoughts pressing down on her, she asked herself the most difficult question: what do I want now? For so long, survival had been her only focus. She had fought for justice, but now it was time to fight for herself. Miriam had always believed in the power of justice, the idea that truth would prevail. Yet the world had shown her that justice could be distorted, manipulated, and used against the innocent. But what truly mattered was how she carried herself in the aftermath. Miriam knew her voice had become one of strength, and it was time to use it for something greater than herself. She thought about her family and the fractured relationships she had left behind. Her mother, now supportive, had offered Miriam the chance to heal. Caleb had expressed his regrets, but Miriam knew that there was a limit to how much could be repaired. The years of betrayal could not be undone overnight, no matter how much forgiveness was offered. But she also realized something important. She did not need to rely on the past anymore. Her journey had taught her that she was stronger than the ties that tried to bind her to old wounds. Miriam stood up from the table and walked over to the window, looking out at the city below. The sky was a blend of dusk and dawn, a reflection of the internal shift she was experiencing. She realized that her true decision was not about what others wanted for her, but about what she wanted for herself. She no longer needed to be defined by the tragedy that had once consumed her. She had a chance to write her own story, and that story would not end in bitterness or revenge. It would be a story of healing, of taking control of her narrative, and of using her experiences to make a difference in the world. As she stood there, with a sense of peace filling her heart, Miriam made her final decision. She would continue to fight for justice, not as a victim, but as a voice for the voiceless. She would use her story to inspire others who had been wrongly condemned, those who were lost in a system that had failed them. It was time to turn her pain into power. She walked back to the table and picked up the phone, making the call that would set her life on a new path. Miriam was not just surviving anymore, she was living, and she was going to make sure the world knew her name. Miriam's journey had been long, painful, and filled with moments of doubt. But as she stood at the threshold of a new beginning, the emotional weight of her past no longer defined her. The years of wrongful condemnation, the haunting memories of the electric chair, the endless battles in court, all of it had shaped her, but it no longer held her captive. The time for mourning what was lost had passed. She had faced the darkest parts of herself, the parts that had been molded by a world that had failed her, and she had emerged stronger, more certain of who she was and what she stood for. In a way, the electric chair had been the crucible that tested her spirit, and although she had been condemned to die, it was in that moment of utter despair that Miriam found her true purpose. Not just to survive, but to live, to heal, and to help others do the same. Her story was one of redemption, not just in the eyes of the law, but in her own eyes as well. Miriam had spent so many years fighting for justice from the outside, but she had come to understand that true justice begins within. It was a lesson that many never learned, that justice isn't merely about proving innocence. It's about finding the strength to reclaim your identity, to demand dignity, and to choose your own future. The system had failed her, but she had not failed herself. As Miriam began to speak at rallies, share her story with the media, and become an advocate for others who had suffered unjust convictions, she could see the difference her words were making. She was no longer the broken woman who had once sat in that cold, sterile courtroom, waiting for a fate sealed by lies. Now, she was the voice of hope for those who had none, the beacon for the hopeless. The relationships she had rebuilt, those with her mother, Caleb, and even her own sense of self, were now stronger. Forgiveness had come, not because they deserved it, but because Miriam knew that carrying the weight of unforgiveness would only keep her trapped in the past. She had learned that peace was found in letting go, not for them, but for herself. Miriam's final decision to stand tall and embrace the future she had the power to create was a testament to her growth. In the end, she found not just justice, but redemption. Her life had been a journey from despair to salvation, and in doing so, she had become a beacon for others, a reminder that no matter how dark the world may seem, there is always light to be found when you refuse to give up. Months passed, and Miriam's life slowly began to settle into a new rhythm. Her name, once whispered with fear and judgment, had now become a symbol of resilience. She had found peace not in the absence of her past, but in her ability to rise above it. One quiet evening, as she sat on the porch of her modest home, the sun setting behind her, Miriam felt a deep sense of gratitude. The world had not been kind, and the journey had been grueling, but she had made it through. As she gazed at the horizon, she could almost feel the weight of every moment that had led her here, but none of it was overwhelming anymore. The pain had been tempered with strength, the grief softened by healing. Miriam's phone buzzed on the table next to her. It was a text from her mother. "I'm proud of you. You've come so far." Miriam smiled softly, her heart swelling with love. It was a simple message, but it carried the weight of everything she had endured. For the first time in years, she felt free. Free from the chains of the past, free from the accusations that had once defined her. In that moment, Miriam understood that her true salvation had not come from God's intervention in her final moments, nor from the justice she had fought so hard for. It had come from her own strength to live after all the tragedy. She had faced the ultimate test and had emerged not just alive, but whole. As the stars began to twinkle above, Miriam stood and walked into her house. She was not the same woman who had once stood in the shadow of an unjust execution. She was someone new, someone who had embraced her power and her future. With a deep breath, she closed the door behind her, leaving the past outside.